Okay, so an essential topic to game development is array list. So, what is array list? An array list is basically a dynamic list or holding of objects in memory that you can access based on an index value. So, an array list essentially what it does is it holds objects for you. It can hold any object, whatever you want it to hold, and it can hold it in a list so you can access it by a index value. And so let's go ahead and jump into what it is. And if you don't really understand the definition, you can actually just Google array list and read more about it on Google. So let's go ahead and dive in. So let's first create an array list. So to create an array list, you simply do array list and the type you want it to hold. We'll let it hold a string. We'll let it hold a bunch of strings, and we can name it our strings. And then we'll go ahead and initialize it to a new array list. And what you'll see here is now what happens is the array list can hold as many, it can grow or it can shrink. But the way I like to do is I usually like to initialize it. I like to set to kind of, if we don't know how many objects we're going to need, we simply just leave this constructor blank, because I believe it actually has 3 constructors we can use. And let's go ahead and import the array list. So there we go. So we have a new array list called our strings.
Okay,
And,
so in this lecture, we're going to be discussing constructors.
We can simply add objects to it dynamically in code here, or we could actually initialize it here. But for the sake of this tutorial, we need to actually do it here. So if we want to set a value to the array to create initially, so let's say if we know we want to have 5 strings in this array, we'll simply supply 5 as a constructor for the array list. And now we're telling it, hey constructor, hey array list, listen up, I need 5 allocations in your list so I can hold 5 different string objects. Alright, so let's go ahead and just leave that as 5, and let's go ahead and use a for loop to add strings to our array list. So let's do for int I equals 0, and I is, and since we know how many objects we need, we could just, if I is less than 5, then we want it to go up by 1. So there we go. So what we're doing is here we're basically looping through this for loop 5 times. So we can actually, like 4 times, because 0 counts as 1. So it was still 5 times, and we're going each time around we're going to add a new string to the string array list. So let's go ahead and do our strings dot add strings. What's going on here? Looks like I'm stuck in the array list. Oh, let me do let's do private here. That may matter. It may just matter. Let's see, our strings. Oh, it didn't matter. Static maybe. Okay, cool. So yeah, we needed to set that to static. So yeah, now what we can do is here, since we loop through, we can simply just add another string. As here, we can just add a string. So we can just do string and space plus I. So there we go. Every time it loops through, it's going to add a new string, and the string is going to be called string, and whatever the value of I is going to be set to. So now to see what gets added, let's actually print. Let's do a method called private void print items. So this method is going to simply print whatever is in that array list. So we could actually use a for loop too here. We could just do for int I is equal to 0. If I is less than our strings dot size, which is going to give us the size of the array or how many objects is there. Then we simply wanted to add one or increment I by 1. So now we can just let's do a print line system dot out dot print line, and let's do our strings dot get I, because we wanted to get whatever I equals. So I is going to be 0, so we're telling it to our strings go get item 0. Then it's going to get increment by 1, and now I is going to be equal to 1, and we're saying our strings go get the element 1 and give it to us and print it, and it's going to go all the way up to 4 or 5. But whenever you're dealing with array list, always remember that whatever you set as the object variable or the object index, always subtract it by 1. It's called an off by 1. So always subtract it by 1. So if you have 4 here, when you try to access those five elements, you need to start at 0, because the elements start at 0 in array list. They don't start at 1, they start at 0. So if we had 5 items, it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is 5, because 0 is essentially 1. So you'll see here, and let's go ahead and print the items. And I'm not sure if this is going to work, because it may get stuck in this for loop, and it may just not work, because it may call this for loop and then it may keep going and call this before the for loop finishes. But whatever, let's see what happens. Oh, it worked. There we are. So there we go. So string 1, string 2, string 3, string 4, and as you see, we added those right here. And as soon as our main method was called, we simply just added string and then the value of I to that string to our array list. Then we printed the items. So we just did another for loop, and we had I. We tested to see if I is less than our strings. If it is, we simply increment the I by 1, and then we simply get whatever I is equal to from the array list, from the string array list. So if I is equal to 1, if I is equal to 0, then we just do our strings get 0, and it's going to return, like you see here, it's going to return string 1. And once it equals 2, or once it equals I equals 1, it's going to say, hey, array list get element 1. Now it's going to return string 2, and so forth and so on. So that's the basics of array list. That's very important in game development. You'll need to understand that if you plan on developing games, because array lists will be very, very essential, and you need them in almost every single type of game you create. I don't think I've ever seen a game that doesn't need an array list or some sort. So, or maybe not an array list, but a list at least of some sort. So, yep. That's our array list lecture, and I believe we only have, this may be our last lecture of the object-oriented section. I believe that's all the essentials. Remember, keyword essential topics that you may need to know for game development. So, like I said, if you don't, like I said on my tutorials, if you don't understand completely, leave a question, leave a comment. Use Google. There's tons of articles about array lists on Google, and you know, make sure you get this down packed.